Why shouldn't it be the case that all mobile activity is personal and all social networks are personal and mobile? The answer is it should. So I started a company. And I didn't invent anything. I didn't come up with a new idea. I don't believe in coming up with new ideas. I believe solely that the new ideas exist in various pockets, and what we can do to exploit them and bring the future along, sort of move our inch along, is to simply take those ideas and bring them to other places. And so when people frequently ask me, so how do you come up with new ideas for business? I say, I don't. Other people come up with the new ideas. I simply bring them somewhere else. I'm merely a merchant of transport. And on the way, I build some technology to support it. What's interesting to me about that is I, at some point, about a year ago, got curious as to where that had come from. So who had the original idea such that this very complex ecosystem would arise in mobile phones? It turns out that the people, if you're familiar with the Docomo network in Japan, the way the Docomo network evolved, the network, this is the mobile phone network that permits such things to have happened, was they had one surprising notion, and that was they were going to open the network, when it initially opened on 3G, to independent application developers. So this is around the year 2000, 1999. And what they did is they created a flurry of innovation, just the way innovation occurred when the PC standardized, and all of a sudden a flurry of applications was spread across a common platform, or when the web created the browser, and all of a sudden a standard base was permitted upon which we have created 1,000 applications. And at that moment in time, a book was just translated into Japanese that had been in English for almost 5 years. And that was a science fiction novel by Neil Stephenson called The Diamond Age. And The Diamond Age was a story written by a science fiction author in the early 90s about a girl that had a tablet like a phone. And it wandered around with her, and it introduced her to all her friends. And it kept contact of where she was, and it kept context of what she was. And its translation into Japanese 12 months later led to independent software developers thinking we can do something like that. And the way they did it, the place they did it, was the only place in the world it could be done at that time. So it all tracks back to Neil Stephenson. He's responsible for the whole future. I like that. I like knowing the provenance of what I poach, you know? If I'm going to go ahead and build a company, I want to someday be able to stand up and attribute it to its true owner. So I've started this company, TrueTap. Its owner, in right, though he's not going to get any profit from it, is Neil Stephenson. So in that spirit, I'm always curious where ideas come from. And if you ever watched the TV show Dragon's Den, you'll know they definitely come from odd places. For those of you who didn't see Dragon's Den, and oddly enough, 55 million Britons missed the show, it's basically 5 putative investors sit in chairs, and some of them are good. And then young and not so young entrepreneurs come up and they pitch their desires and their wishes and their aspirations to us. And we either spend our children's inheritance on them and reach into our pockets and invest, or as in my case, frequently did not. And I was always very curious where their ideas came from. So usually, it was a habit of mine when I was permitted to get a word in edgewise around some of the other egos jostling for position on stage. I certainly wouldn't mention Peter. And I would ask them, so where did your idea come from? You know, what's the provenance of this idea? The one in particular I will never forget was this fellow. I never remember their names, but I can remember their products terribly well. He was a Maxi-Mat man, I called him. He had invented this product. I could have sworn what he said was that he had invented a product where if you put it on the floor and your dog sat on it, it would suck the smell off your dog. Which, if you think about it, it's a very impressive accomplishment, especially if you've ever smelled my dog. And in fact, he got off to a very bad start because he kind of did a reverse pitch. He stood up and he said, who here has a dog? And myself and Peter Jones raised our hands. And then he said, well, you know, your dogs stink. He didn't precisely say it with the rather southern drawl I just affected, but he more or less said, your dogs stink. And I took some offense at that. Peter ended up engaging in a conversation. He asserted he loved his dog's smell, which I didn't really want to have as a conversation. And so when they sort of finished that and they got back to the heart of the matter, he then went on to pitch. It turns out I misunderstood him. The idea was not so much that this Maxi-Mat, this mat would smell my dog, but it wouldn't acquire the smell of my dog, and thus would stay fresh and clean in whatever room it was in, a much more modest technology accomplishment. What made him such an interesting inventor, and of course his idea had come from the fact that he had a dog and the dog had a blanket and the blanket got smelly, so it was a reasonably modest provenance. But what was fascinating about him was that he represented to me possibly the most pure example of entrepreneurial zeal I've ever met, and especially when it's not wrapped against a good innovation. right? And so I took dispute with him. I said, more or less, I actually don't think this will sell. And I said, I've got a dog. We have a system for this already. It's got a lot of moving parts. You've got competition. He goes, I have no competition, which is a great line because that's never the case. And he said, so tell me the competition. So I said, fine. It's got a bunch of parts. It's got a blanket. It's got 2 kids. There's a bathtub and a clothes washer. I said, it kind of works like this. The dog sits on the blanket gets smelly. The blanket goes into the washer. I said, I've never actually done it, but I'm told it happens regularly. The kids take the dog. The kids and the dog go in the bathroom. The dog comes out clean. The kids come out dirty. It's sort of a transfer process. I said, it's family entertainment, it's innovation, and it's a sunk cost. I said, that's your competition. He thought I was making fun of him. I may have been, but I was also telling the truth. He then went on to say, so I said to him, I don't believe. He said, you're not my customer. I got fired as a customer, which is humiliating on TV. And I said, that's fine, but I'm your potential investor. So if you want me to believe, you need to reach out into the world and tell me how others would do it. I said, the number one challenge I have with the companies I start is I am frequently creating products and services for which there is no current need. We've lived without it forever, as a rule, because it hasn't started yet. I said, so it's a challenge that I am very, very interested in myself and others. I said, if you're going to innovate, you got to innovate against desire, or innovate against need, or you have to manufacture desire, or you have to recognize unknown desires, but somewhere in this equation, there has to be desire or need. And so I said, in simple forms, how do you know that people are going to love this? How do you know people want this? He goes, let me tell you. Everyone I know that I've shown it to, all my family, all my friends, they all tell me it's great. Now, this is such a fallacious piece of reasoning that I've given it a name. I call this ugly baby syndrome. No, let me explain. It bears explaining because it might not be obvious. So let's say, by way of example, that you meet a young mother and she has, doesn't have to be young, I guess, you meet a young mother and she has a new baby and the baby's, ugly. What do you say? God, that baby ugly? Of course not. You say things like, gosh, he looks like his father, or I'm sure he'll grow into that nose. You say something, right? What you don't say is, God, what an ugly baby. Why don't you say it? Because you've got a social tie to this person. There's relationships. I'm an inventor. I go to my friend. I go to my family, people with whom I have emotional ties. I say, look at my Maximat. It sucks the smell off of, it doesn't acquire the smell of dogs. Sorry, I still get confused. What do they say? They say, oh man, I left my wallet at home, but that is a cool product. I am sure to buy 5 of those as soon as they're on the market. Ugly baby syndrome. The last thing you can tell an inventor is that their invention sucks. The most responsible thing you can tell an inventor is that their invention sucks. The most important thing in innovation is knowing when it serves a purpose and knowing when it never will. To me, interestingly enough, it's the provenance of innovations that usually tells us whether there's a need. What do I mean? I mean, he observed that blankets smelled. He never asked himself whether that was a problem. I know it's a terribly trivial example, but I love him, and I always will love him, because he was so blind to this. I actually said to him, have you ever considered just going to Crufts, taking a booth, and letting yourself sell to strangers? And he said, that's ridiculous. You can't grow a national business out of a booth at Crufts. I thought, well, we're not discussing whether you're going to grow a national business. We're discussing whether you have a business at all. And you may find this surprising, but I didn't actually invest in his miracle thing, Maximat. It turns out, ironically enough, they did a follow-up show and a year later, and it turns out the thing about the Maximat that was so compelling is apparently it does need to get washed every once in a while, and the reason he never brought it to market is when you wash it, it falls apart. And so it has now disappeared without a trace and is no longer on the market. I only had a very confined moment today, and so I have been relatively incoherent in pursuit of the time I had with you. So if there's anything you take away from what I've said, take this. Innovation is how the future moves to the present, right? It's the transport mechanism, and it hits us at different points in time. And the way it usually hits us is we see what doesn't work. It's the annoyances of our daily life. And I would assert that the creative gap, the spark that we're jumping when we start a new business or we do something innovative, is to, 1, recognize the pain, and 2, to look around. And I would assert that the way to invent the future is not to invent the future, but to look how others are inventing the future around us and bring that to the rest of the world. Thank you very much.